Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. In 2 weeks' time, when the Minister of Finance, who's just resumed his seat, comes to deliver the budget, we'll be on this side of the House looking expectantly forward to what we were told we would be getting in the budget in this year, which is a surplus, which in turn would have allowed the Minister of Finance to restart contributions to this fund. But sadly, Mr Speaker, from what we've heard in recent days, the Finance Minister is set to break that promise to New Zealanders that there would be a surplus this year, and presumably in turn break another promise, which is that he would restart contributions to the Cullen Fund, to the Super Fund, once we got into surplus. And it is, on this side of the House, regrettable, Mr Speaker, that the fund doesn't have that. It's performing extremely well, that is true. But the bottom line is, in order to continue to provide New Zealanders with security in their retirement in the future, we would like to see contributions restart. I know Chris Bishop wants to see contributions restart to the scheme, but that will only occur when this government sorts out its finances, when it finally follows through on what it promised New Zealanders and actually gets us into surplus. Sadly, from what we heard today, Mr Speaker, from the Finance Minister in question time, I don't think we are going to see any new ideas. I think they're out of ideas, they're out of touch, and they're not able to come up with things that will allow them in this budget to restart contributions to the New Zealand Super Fund. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party will be supporting this legislation, although I do note that it would be good to see the SOP that the Minister referred to. It didn't come through the Select Committee. And it will be interesting to see that arrive, I guess, on the floor of the House at some point. And obviously we would want to read that before committing to supporting it. But in general, this bill is largely of a technical nature. The New Zealand Superannuation Fund came to the committee and explained in some detail the way in which they wanted to use fund investment vehicles to continue to grow the fund in a sustainable way. At the moment, as the Minister has articulated, Section 59 of the Act prevents the Guardians from controlling any other entity. When the legislation was created, the purpose for that was to ensure that this was genuinely an investment fund, a fund that took the resources of New Zealanders and turned that into superannuation payments for the future based on strategic and good investments, not based on the fund, the guardians of the fund being the controllers or the owners or the directors of entities, but rather using those resources to invest. Guardians of investment. Section 59 made that clear, but what's become clear to the Guardians and what they brought to the committee was the notion that actually, in order to be the most effective investors of New Zealanders' funds, that they needed to be able to make use of funding investment vehicles. They were challenged in the committee about really what did this mean? Did this make them the controllers of these entities in some way or other? But they were able to make a case, Mr Speaker, to the committee that actually what it will mean is that they will control the assets created by these entities, but they don't have control of the businesses themselves. To put it in layperson's terms, Mr Speaker, we're not expecting the Guardians to go out and run farms or forests or whatever it is that they invest in, but that they will have asset investment vehicles that will allow them to be more efficient and more effective in getting returns for the taxpayers. And on that basis, Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House consider that that approach is good. There are enough rules around ensuring that the investments are prudent that we feel that means that the overall balance of the Act is not unduly changed by this particular amendment, but clearly it does make a change to Section 59, and we thought that was justified in this case. There is, the Minister raised some questions about the role of the Minister of Finance in whether or not particular funding decisions should be made. And I want to make clear on this side of the House, we support the independence of the Guardians. We think that has served the fund well. Quite clearly, the Guardians operate under whatever the parameters of the Act are, and today we're changing one of those parameters. It would be completely possible and conceivable and within the spirit of the law for a future government to decide to change some of those parameters. And an example of that, Mr Speaker, would be in the consideration of how much investment happens in New Zealand. That wouldn't be telling the fund what investment to make. It wouldn't be directing the fund to say you must invest in a particular company or in a particular class of asset. But what it would be doing is recognising something that the fund itself has said, which they would like to increase the proportion of their investments into New Zealand. And from a Labour Party point of view, we do think that is something worthy of consideration. We do think that, for an example, it would be possible to take a very small portion of the fund's resources and see them invested in small and medium enterprises, or in funds that would in turn support small and medium enterprises. That is not the Minister of Finance directing how an investment would be made. It is merely creating the framework in which the Guardians would operate. So I don't think the Minister should take any indication that we're interested in that kind of role for the fund in compromising the way that the Guardians work or the way that their independence operates. So, Mr Speaker, we certainly on the main provision in the bill have been convinced by the argument advanced by the fund and the controls that are around that. There are a number of other matters that are dealt with that are largely of technical nature. I want to refer to one of those now, and that is the question of the application of the Official Information Act and the Ombudsman's Acts to these new funds that are going to be created, fund investment vehicles rather, that are going to be created, or the use of them is going to be enabled under this legislation. We did discuss this in some detail because one of the things that the Minister has noted and others have noted is the transparency of the fund is a good thing. It, for instance, enables parties in this House to raise concerns about some of the classes of assets and some of the investments that the fund makes, and that's exactly as it should be. What, however, we discussed at the committee was whether actually it is right that the actual fund investment vehicles themselves will be subject to the OIA. And what was brought forward to us was, of course, the fact that the Guardians themselves are subject to the OIA. So in their actions, all information that they hold about the fund investment vehicles are now subject to the OIA. The fund investment vehicles themselves are at arm's length and will now not be subject to the OIA or the Ombudsman's Act. I have to say, Mr Speaker, that on this side of the House there is a balance to be struck here, and I think we need to see over time how the vehicles operate to ensure that we are getting the level of transparency that we've gotten used to in the overall operation of the fund. So we certainly can support that clause on the grounds that all of the information that the Guardians themselves hold about an investment vehicle is subject to the OIA and indeed through that to the Ombudsman's Act, but that the fund investment vehicle itself is not directly under those acts. We will watch to see how that works, but I'm pretty clear that we should continue to get the same level of transparency that we've had up to now. So, Mr Speaker, those are two of the main issues that arose in the consideration of this. Mr Chair, just in the brief time remaining to me, I want to say two things that arose around the time that we were considering this bill that are relevant. And the first of those is the excellent returns of the fund. We should be proud that the fund has now got itself up to nearly $30 billion worth of value. It has done a good job and we should respect that. However, that doesn't mean that the fund is not open to scrutiny for particular types of investment. And at the time this arose, we learned of the nearly $200 million that had been lost in the investment into the Portuguese bank, the Espírito Banco of Portugal. We are still concerned on this side of the House that the cash fund that is used for those investments, while it will inherently be more risky, those investments that go through several pairs of hands that are actually, in this case, trying to save a bank which was already known to be in trouble, we do need our fund to be careful in that management. We do need to know that due diligence is done. The fund has assured us it did that due diligence, but that kind of investment is the one that we obviously want to know about. We're not saying that can't be made, but we do believe that that level of risk through that series of transactions is one that we need to look after. Myself and other members of the Labour caucus have met with the fund. We've discussed this. We are aware that they are following through on this. We want to make sure that they do follow through. They believe what has happened is illegal and they should be able to have remedy through the courts. But it is an example of where transparency is important, that we can see that kind of investment and raise questions about its suitability. But Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we're very proud about the Labour Party's association with this fund. We thank Michael Cullen for his involvement in creating it, and we do believe it continues to serve New Zealand as well.
I call Chris Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Pleasure to take a call on the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Amendment Bill. This is a sensible